everyone, and welcome to the latest edition of the Economist Intelligence Unit's Global Outlook video. My name is Agathe Demarais, and I'm the Global Forecasting Director at the Economist Intelligence Unit. I'm joined today by Nick Marro, our lead for Global Trade and Asia analyst, and Agnese Ortolani, a senior analyst in our Europe team. Today, we're going to discuss global trade and also trade from a European perspective. Trade made the headlines in 2018 and 2019, a bit less in 2020, but it doesn't mean that our analysts didn't take a close look at these very important topics in the meantime. So first, Nick, I'm going to turn to you, and perhaps as an intro question, how did trade fare during the pandemic, and what's your forecast for this year and beyond?
Thanks, Agathe. And well, actually, global trade held up quite well in 2020, dashing initial expectations of a severe collapse in trade volumes. And that happened even as global economic activity went into freefall across most major markets. Much of this was sustained by the resilience of Asian economies in particular, where early success in pandemic mitigation and allowed several countries to avoid prolonged lockdowns that would have otherwise disrupted supply-side activities like production. That then allowed a number of economies, such as China, Taiwan, and Vietnam, to capitalize on booming global demand for consumer electronics, entertainment goods, and other items tied to remote working and remote learning arrangements. Looking forward, we're expecting a lot of that resilience to continue into this year. Demand for lockdown goods should be sustained as COVID-19 resurgence remains a persistent risk for most economies, despite the global vaccine rollout. And the normalization of global economic activity will also provide a natural cushion to trade volumes, particularly as rebounding economic activity improves consumer and investor confidence. But by region, we expect Asia to stage the fastest trade recovery, with export and import levels approaching pre-pandemic levels by later this year. That recovery is going to be a bit more dragged out by other regions, however, including in Europe and North America, but also among many developing countries where a return to normalcy will really depend on vaccine rollouts.
Speaking of vaccines, that's actually a perfect transition to what is my second question for you, Nick. We've seen a lot of noise recently about vaccine nationalism, that is to say, many countries, developed countries essentially, keeping vaccines for themselves at the expense of developing countries. What's happening here, do you think?
Yeah, this is a pretty worrisome development, considering that the fight against COVID-19 really can't be won unless we're all vaccinated. That said, we've seen moves by the EU to restrict vaccine shipments out of the bloc, while the US has invoked its Defense Production Act, which has prevented the overseas shipment of critical raw materials used in vaccine production elsewhere. India has also recently introduced vaccine export curbs, which are likely going to have repercussions for inoculation timelines across much of the developing world, particularly in Asia and Africa. And that's all really worrisome because it's coming at a time when the fight against COVID-19 is still very much in its infancy, and because it really risks sparking protectionist tendencies across many different markets. That's one of the big risk areas that we've identified over the past couple of months as global economic activity has normalized. That is, how countries might engage in protectionist activities as part of their post-pandemic recovery plans. And this is particularly concerning when we think about the geopolitical backdrop to what's happening in the global trade landscape, particularly as diplomatic frictions increasingly drive risks around supply chain resilience and commercial activity.
Since you mentioned diplomatic frictions, these frictions between the US and China underpinned a lot of the trade disruptions that we noticed in 2018 and 2019, essentially the US-China trade war. What's the outlook for US-China relations now that Biden is the US president?
Well, in short, I think it's still going to be pretty complicated. The US-China relationship remains under severe strain, but what's been most significant over the past couple of weeks has been a deterioration in China's ties with the West more broadly, and that includes the EU, Australia, Canada, and others. And much of this is tied to the application of sanctions by Western countries in response to China's actions in Xinjiang over its human rights abuses, as well as Hong Kong, where it's dismantled a lot of the democratic institutions in that territory. China has responded with sanctions of its own, as well as more recently, state media campaigns against Western apparel firms in its market, many of whom had previously distanced themselves from Xinjiang-sourced cotton. Now, for a few years now, the EIU has been warning about the risk of companies and third countries being forced to choose sides between the US and China, and that risk is now very much becoming a reality. For instance, the Western companies who made statements rejecting the use of Xinjiang cotton partially did so because of a US withholding release order released last year around forced labor, which has enhanced US customs scrutiny over cotton imports sourced from that region. Western companies really had to comply if they wanted to preserve their access to the US market. And I think one of the most interesting places where all of these dynamics are going to be playing out is going to be in Europe. The EU, for instance, has tried very hard to pursue what it's trying to call, or what it's calling, strategic autonomy when it comes to balancing its relations between the US and China. But this hasn't ultimately done much to keep it from getting caught in the crossfire of US-China tensions.
Thanks so much, Nick. And that's actually a perfect transition before we turn to you, Agnese. So perhaps I'm going to ask you the same question as the one I asked Nick to start with. How did trade hold up in Europe during the pandemic, and what's our forecast for this year and beyond?
So in the EU, exports and imports of goods contracted by about 9 and 11% respectively in 2020, which is half of the collapse in extra-EU trade that took place during the global financial crisis. And we saw exports recovering relatively quickly last year, mostly due to the resilience of major trade partners in Asia, which were successful in containing the pandemic relatively rapidly, as Nick said. And in the short term, we expect exports to be an important driver of the economic recovery in Europe, given that the domestic demand will remain subdued until the second half of this year, mostly owing to the renewed lockdowns and restrictions that we are seeing now in most of the region. And most particularly, Europe will continue to benefit from two interrelated factors. First, a more rapid recovery in Asia, which will continue to support external demand for goods such as cars and industrial supplies, with a particularly impact on the industrial sectors of countries like Germany and Italy, which have strong ties with China. And secondly, by the fact that the second wave of the pandemic has had a much more limited impact on economic output, and the exports have driven a recovery in manufacturing, which is partially mitigating losses in the services sector. And production volumes now remain much higher than during the initial 2020 lockdowns. And industrial sectors in most EU countries have maintained monthly growth in manufacturing. So overall, we expect Europe to experience a slower recovery in trade than Asia and the US, with exports and imports levels approaching the pre-pandemic levels by 2022 on average, which is in line with the recovery in economic output that we are seeing for the region.
Thanks so much. And actually, so at the EAU, we love to have a central forecast, a central scenario, and then to take a look at some risks. So how about risks ahead?
Well, not surprisingly, trade disruptions with the UK, which is the EU's third main trade partner after China and the US, will be a key factor preventing a stronger rebound in EU export growth this year. Following the end of the Brexit transition period, and despite a limited last-minute agreement on tariffs at the end of last year, there has been a significant fall in EU-UK trade. And we saw EU exports and imports from the UK contracting by over 30% and almost 60% respectively in January. As especially new non-tariff barriers resulted in some logistical difficulties for firms both in the UK and Europe. With the UK now starting checks at the border from April, and with full border checks being introduced in July, we expect UK-EU trade to remain profoundly disrupted this year. And in terms of key risks to our focus, of course, the main one is the epidemiological outlook for the region, because despite the initial slow vaccine rollout in the region, we believe that the EU will have immunized about of its population by the end of this year. But failure to achieve herd immunity by the autumn, when the cooler temperatures and more indoor interaction will raise the transmission rate, would mean a return to restrictions, which could choke up the economic recovery and also intra-EU trade. And finally, what we are seeing as an export-led recovery, one of the key risks is that we strengthen the divergences within Europe that we already saw before the crisis, and we will see tourism-focused countries in the south, such as Greece and Spain, that will hit worse, that will recover effectively more slowly than the industrial export-oriented economies in the north, such as Germany or the Netherlands. But overall, over-reliance on exports also poses some risks, as the growing geopolitical tensions with China illustrate.
So actually, we've discussed with Nick that geopolitics is a big factor for global trade. How about geopolitics seen from Europe's perspective? That is to say, EU relations with the US, now that Biden is president, and also EU relations with China.
With Mr. Biden as US president, we expect EU-US relations to improve, which will lead also to an improvement in trade relations between the US and the EU. And we also see a return to an Obama-era focus on multilateral engagement and greater scope for cooperation on climate change, for instance. And we'll see Biden trying to build a common position with the EU against China, but issues such as defense spending with the NATO and the EU deep economic ties with China will remain contentious issues with the US. Europe will continue to engage with China in areas of mutual interest, but only on a transactional basis. And trade with China will still remain constrained by concerns over labor rights, human rights, and environmental standards. We saw in December that the EU and China agreed to conclude the negotiation on a comprehensive agreement on investment, but we expect the ratification process by the European Parliament to be complicated by the recent deterioration in EU-China relations. And with the imposition of EU sanctions against China over human rights abuses in Xinjiang and retaliatory sanctions against 10 EU individuals and 4 organizations in late March, the ratification of the deal by the European Parliament this year is unlikely, and a passage next year remains possible, but is in greater doubt following these developments. And in addition, we don't expect this agreement to be a game changer for EU companies that hopes to deepen their access to China's market. But Europe is increasingly conscious of its over-reliance on China for trade. And so it has also recently aimed to diversify to other international partners. For instance, the 3 nations, France, Germany, and the Netherlands, now have an official economic and security strategy for the Indo-Pacific region. And we anticipate growing EU efforts in this area.
Thanks so much, Agnese, and thanks so much, Nick, for all your analysis. We're coming to the end of our video now. You can always find our latest analysis and our latest outlooks on our website, www.eau.com. Keep an eye on our latest analysis, for instance, on vaccine diplomacy, the impact of the pandemic on supply chains, or the global rollout of coronavirus vaccines. You can also follow us on Twitter. Our handles should show nicely on your screen, or at the EAU. Thank you very much for joining us today. Stay safe. Goodbye.